In the heart of New Orleans, the courthouse stood as a symbol of justice, but for Judge Leah Marshall, it was also a reminder of the challenges she faced as a black woman in a predominantly white legal system. Today was particularly significant. It marked the opening day of a high-profile trial that could change the way racial profiling was handled in Louisiana forever. Leah parked her sedan in front of the courthouse, glancing at the clock on her dashboard. She had only 10 minutes until the trial began, and her heart raced with a mix of anxiety and determination as she stepped out of her car. Leah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. She had meticulously prepared for this day, knowing that the case of Kevin Daniels, a young black man arrested without cause, was not just about him, it was personal. The officer who had detained him claimed Kevin fit the description of someone involved in suspicious activity, a narrative all too familiar to Leah. Instead of using the grand entrance, Leah opted for a side door to avoid the throng of reporters outside. As she approached, she noticed a young white police officer standing guard. His posture was rigid, and his eyes followed her closely. Leah reached for her ID badge, but before she could present it, the officer blocked her path. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," he said, his tone sharp. Leah raised her eyebrows, taken aback. "I'm Judge Marshall," she replied, lifting her badge higher for him to see. "I'm presiding over the Daniels case this morning." The officer didn't even glance at the badge. Instead, he scanned her up and down with a cold, calculating gaze. Leah felt a familiar burn of anger rise in her chest but kept her face calm. "There's been an incident nearby, and you match the description of someone involved. I need you to answer a few questions," he continued, his voice laced with suspicion. Leah stared at him, trying to process what was happening. The irony was suffocating. Here she was, about to oversee a trial about racial profiling, and she was being racially profiled at the courthouse doors. "Officer," she said, her voice steady, "I don't have time for this. The trial starts in less than 10 minutes, and I need to get inside." The officer's hand hovered over his belt, close to his handcuffs. "I don't care who you say you are, ma'am," he snapped, stepping closer. "You're going to need to come with me." Leah's breath hitched. This was escalating quickly. She could see the look in his eyes, the kind of look she'd seen too many times growing up in the South, a mix of suspicion and contempt. It wasn't about her being a judge, it was about her being black. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Leah turned to see an older black officer approaching, his face a mix of surprise and concern. "Marshall," he exclaimed, recognizing her. "Yes, I'm Judge Marshall," Leah replied, her voice tight. The older officer shot a glance at the younger one. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice firm. The younger officer, still fuming, took a reluctant step back. "She matches the description," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "That's the judge," the older officer snapped. "Do you want to lose your job?" Leah forced herself to take a deep breath. She had to stay calm. Losing her temper now would only play into the hands of someone like this. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the older officer asked, his voice softening. Leah nodded, though her jaw was clenched. "I'm fine, thank you." Without another word, she turned and walked into the courthouse, her heart still racing. The familiar sterile halls welcomed her with the comfort of routine, but the encounter outside replayed in her head on a loop. She had dealt with racism her entire life, but for it to happen like this on the day of this trial was almost too much. The courtroom quieted as Leah banged her gavel, calling the room to order. The trial began smoothly enough with opening statements from both sides, but Leah's mind kept drifting back to the officer outside. His sneering face, the way he had judged her in an instant, it felt too close to the case she was now presiding over. Then came the first witness, Kevin Daniels himself. Leah leaned forward slightly as he took the stand, his testimony raw and painful. He described being stopped by the police for simply walking in his own neighborhood. He hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't even been acting suspiciously, yet he was treated like a criminal, handcuffed and humiliated in front of his neighbors. Leah could feel the weight of his words as he spoke. She had heard stories like this before, countless times, but today it hit differently. It wasn't just about Kevin Daniels. It was about the countless others like him, and it was about her. Halfway through the testimony, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and Leah's heart sank. The young officer from earlier, the one who had stopped her, walked into the room. He made his way to the witness stand, his face pale and tense. Leah's eyes followed him, every nerve in her body on edge. The prosecutor stood, addressing the court. "We would like to call Officer Bill Wilkins to the stand." Leah hadn't even caught his name before, but now he was here, and she felt a mix of anger and anticipation. Bill Wilkins took the stand, his movements stiff and awkward. Leah had to remind herself to remain impartial, to stay professional, but it was hard. This was the same man who had looked at her not as a judge but as a suspect. Wilkins shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. The prosecutor began questioning him, asking him to describe his role in Kevin Daniels' arrest. "I was patrolling the neighborhood when I saw Daniels," Wilkins began, his voice lacking the confidence he had shown earlier. Leah's grip on her gavel tightened. Out of place, that phrase she had heard too many times. It was code for, "He was black, and I didn't think he should be there." The prosecutor pressed on, his tone sharp. "Did you find anything on Mr. Daniels that suggested he had committed a crime?" Bill hesitated, his face flushing. "No," he admitted. The room was silent for a moment, and Leah could feel the tension building thick and palpable. She glanced over at the jury, watching their reactions. Some were clearly moved, others seemed conflicted, but the truth was plain as day. Kevin Daniels had been arrested for nothing more than being blacked up. Bill's testimony continued, his story unraveling with every question the prosecutor asked. Small inconsistencies began to appear, his version of events falling apart. Leah watched him closely, noticing how his eyes kept flickering toward her, filled with discomfort. He knew who she was now, and he knew exactly what he had done. When the prosecutor finally finished, Bill looked like a shell of the man who had tried to detain her outside the courthouse. Leah felt no pity for him, but she did feel the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about one case, it was about a system that had allowed people like Bill to operate unchecked for too long. Yes, the trial continued. Leah fought to keep her emotions in check. She had to remain neutral, had to ensure that justice was served, but it was hard. The parallels between her experience and the case in front of her were impossible to ignore. By the end of the day, the courtroom was buzzing with tension. The defense attorney made his closing statements, trying to paint Bill as a well-meaning officer who had made an honest mistake. But Leah knew better, and so did the prosecutor, Samantha Green. Samantha rose for her final argument, turning to the jury, her voice steady and powerful. "This case is not just about Kevin Daniels," she said. "It's about a pattern that we've seen too often in our justice system. It's about officers like Bill Wilkins who see a young black man in a neighborhood and assume he must be up to no good. It's about how this assumption leads to wrongful arrests, to humiliation, to injustice. And it's time to say enough." The courtroom was silent as Samantha's words sank in. Leah could feel the shift in the room. The jury was listening. They understood. When the trial finally came to a close, Leah dismissed the courtroom for the day but remained seated for a moment longer, her mind racing. She had done her job, had presided over the case fairly, but the encounter outside the courthouse still gnawed at her. It was a reminder that no matter her position, no matter her accomplishments, she would always be seen through the lens of her race. Suddenly, the door to the courtroom opened, and Sergeant Michael Harris, the older officer who had intervened earlier, walked in. He approached the bench quietly, his face a mix of concern and something else, something like hope. "Judge Marshall," he said softly, "can I have a word?" Leah looked up, surprised to see him. "Of course." Harris sat down, folding his hands in front of him. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you did today." Leah raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For handling this case the way you did," Harris replied. "For holding us accountable. We need that. The system needs that." Leah let out a long breath, leaning back in her chair. "I appreciate that, Sergeant, but it doesn't feel like enough. This was just one case. There are so many more out there." Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. But that's why we have to keep pushing. It's not going to change overnight, but every step matters. Every case like this chips away at the bigger problem." Leah was silent for a moment, thinking about his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that real change was possible, but after everything she had seen, it was hard to hold on to that hope. "What about Wilkins?" she asked quietly. "What happens to officers like him, ones who've been taught to think a certain way?" Harris sighed. "I'm not gonna lie, it's hard. There are a lot of guys like him. But there are also people like me trying to change things from the inside, and I'll keep doing that as long as I can." Leah looked at him, seeing the weariness in his eyes but also the determination. It was the same determination she felt despite the setbacks and frustrations. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge," Harris said. "That's how we change this, piece by piece." Leah nodded slowly. "Piece by piece," she echoed as Harris left the room. She sat back in her chair, staring at the empty courtroom. The fight wasn't over, it never would be. But today, they had taken one step forward, and that, she thought, was how change began. As the courtroom emptied and the echoes of the verdict still lingered in the air, Leah Marshall remained seated at the bench, her mind buzzing with the weight of what had just transpired. It wasn't a victory she could savor. The trial was over, but its impact had just begun. For Leah, the fight for justice wasn't confined to this room. It stretched far beyond these walls into communities still grappling with the same issues that had brought Kevin Daniels here in the first place. She stood up, gathering her files, when a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Kevin Daniels approaching her with his attorney. His face was calm now, though the tension from the last few days had clearly worn him down. "Judge Marshall," Kevin said, his voice low but steady, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Leah looked at him, pausing for a moment before responding. "You don't need to thank me, Kevin. I was just doing my job." Kevin shook his head. "No, it's more than that. This trial, it wasn't just about me. It was about showing people what really happens out there, what we go through. You gave me a voice." Leah's chest tightened. She understood what he meant, and she nodded. "I hope this is a step toward change," she said, her words carefully chosen. "But it's just one case. We still have a long way to go." Kevin's eyes softened with understanding. "I know, but it's a start, and for that, I'm grateful." Leah watched him leave, his attorney close behind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was so much more left to be done. One trial, one verdict, wasn't enough to dismantle a system that had been built over centuries. But she knew Kevin was right. It was a start. As Leah exited the courthouse, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice was far from over, but today, they had taken a significant step forward. And with each step, she would continue to push for change, not just for Kevin Daniels, but for everyone who had ever been judged by the color of their skin.